Muy buenos días, muy buenas tardes, muy buenas noches. Este es el programa de la historia de las palabras. El programa de hoy va a ser principalmente en inglés. Tenemos un compañero que conocemos en Occupy, Jeff Green, quien nos va a dar una reseña histórica sobre epidemias y situaciones similares que han pasado en la historia, y el objetivo más que nada es tratar de entender qué cambios suceden después de una situación social como la presente que tenemos. This is the program of the story of the wars. The story of the wars is mainly in Spanish. The story of the wars is taken from the legend Mayans that imply that the gods create us and they give us, they create mirrors that put in front of any of us, so in the reflection we can all grow. The program is mainly in Spanish, but this thing will be in English. We got with us El Maestro Garcia, who's always is part of the program, a standard part of the program. We got Tonatiuh Ayala in Chicago. They are on his own house because of the situation. And we got with us also Jeff Green. Jeff Green, we know him. We met him on Occupy Riverside, and he studied history. And we're going to try to work out the different situations on history where epidemics and social situations like this occur on to humanity, and what the aftermath, what social change happens. Jeff, how are you? ¿Cómo estás?
Good. How are you doing?
All right, I think. So far, the virus hasn't been found me, and I hope he doesn't. Well, Jeff, normally on the Spanish version of this program, we ask people to give us a little bit of a sense of themselves, the personal things, where you grew up, where you went to school, something that is not related to you, your work that you done in Occupy or as an activist or things like that, so in order to people get familiar with you.
Okay. Well, I was born about in Fontana, California, about 20 miles from where I'm at right now, so I've made it pretty far in life. And I went to University of California at Riverside, and I graduated my degree in history, and I've worked in various capacities, from book publisher to building websites and programming. I've done, various projects involved in, right now I work for a nonprofit called California Partnership, and I do policy research, and I also have we do a lot of campaign work, so I have a campaign app that I built called Voter Reach, and we use that to phone bank, canvas, and text and things like that. And yeah, I've studied history, and
Okay.
I've been fascinated with history my whole life. So
On that field, we've been conversating about it several times, but one of the things that we conversate is to see if we understand the aftermath, what social situations were within an epidemic or a social change like this, and what happened after, with the hope that we can somehow maybe understand the possibility that something we can change through this crisis. How would you start? Most of everybody that I been hearing talking about it, they start with the 1950s, the plague, the 1400s, the plague.
yeah.
That,
Well, yeah, and that's, I think, where our conversation, sort of began. And after the plague, there was a shortage of peasants, and so a lot of there were a lot.
What
of
was the
social
situation
changes.
before the plague? The plague for the peasants. How they were living.
Very, very tied to the land, and so it was depending on where you went, because again, feudalism was different in different places, and so not all the same rules applied all over the place. It varied from place to place, but generally peasants were tied to the land. They could not travel freely. They couldn't leave. They had no rights and they were very much the situation that we're in the United States right now, if you ask me. But we are not as tied to land as we are to debt. And the situation after the plague, after, approximately a third of the people in Europe died, there's a shortage, of workers. And so in order to attract more people to an area, they, gave more rights, gave more benefits. And that opened up a whole new era in, some, just a lot of inherited new wealth, a lot of people that really shuffled society, and so created a lot more and varied expectations among people, and led to a lot of the developments. People see that as the start of a lot of the developments in the Renaissance and in the Enlightenment.
We can say that somehow they kind of bear the condition due to the shortage of workers or other things that the people with money or control, they need them desperately. They could not repress them anymore after that.
They couldn't repress them as much. They were still very repressed.
Maestro Garcia, you are a retired professor from university. Anything you may wanted to add to it? What do you think?
Well, I think that Jeff has described that situation back then in Europe, where you had the workers, in effect, tied to the land, and there was a different type of relationship between the Lord and the serfs. The Lord had certain responsibilities towards the serfs, too, to see that, one, they had work, that they had the basis to grow a little food on their own, that there was an obligation that ran both ways. And of course, the oppression and the misuse of workers was growing over the years, as the self-perceived needs of those in charge, whether they were the lords of the state or the lords of the church, were constantly trying to extract more and more from workers. And of course, the plague just disrupted that and brought about changes in the relationship, because then you have, you almost want to talk about an advantage or leverage given to workers, and they begin to make demands back, which disrupted those social relationships and brought about the beginnings of new types of relationships. And when we see that situation, people say, well, that was Europe. That was, if we think of the Americas, it was shortly after that disruption. 100 years or so is nothing in human history. We see the invasion of the Americas by European powers who were feudalistic in nature, but because of those changes that were taking place, you see some new types of social and economic relationships developing. The roots of the capitalist system and the development of that in Europe was made possible because of the extraction of the wealth, particularly gold and silver, from the Americas, other things such as cochinilla dyes and so on that were even more valuable pound for pound than gold. And then, but what happens in the Americas, and when we look at it, the Europeans brought their own plague, not the big plague, but what we would consider normal diseases, the childhood diseases of smallpox, diphtheria, these kinds of things that were unknown in the Americas. Therefore, people didn't have immunity. So you see in the colonial process, the destruction and the reduction of the populations of the Americas. Some people estimate the loss of perhaps 80-90% of the population in many areas, particularly where the populations were concentrated in places like central Mexico. And so there's a real dislocation, destruction of the previous relationships, what the remnants of which we might see now in, the usos y costumbres and so on. But this is tremendous. It's like a social tsunami that hits the Americas, and then the remnants are drawn into these new relationships, quasi-feudalistic European relationships.
I may say something that, see if we can go back to the plague, but I'd like to say something that makes it sound relevant to the situation of that is evolving today, at least in some places of the world. When the Europeans came this way, they didn't have the social custom or social desire of way of being by taking showers. They were not really that clean, and they were not really that people who
they were
compared to the indigenous, that they have more clean ways to live life. Is that true, Jeff? That it was part of the pattern over there. That the contaminations, the sewers, the ways to dispose of the human waste did create, and the repression did create maybe source of this plague, or am I wrong?
No, it varies. It varied from place to place, even in Europe, and so I don't know that would hold up necessarily. There were the people that did come to the Americas were largely, sailors and eventually the colonists. And there's a whole different, I think, culture depending on, which, if it was the Dutch or if it was the English or if it was the Spanish or Portuguese. And they all had their own unique, hygiene practices and
or lack of them.
You're right. And then, how they organized their cities versus how they came over on a boat also, I think, is very different. But I think that there wasn't a lot of knowledge about, obviously, disease until, there was some intentional spreading of smallpox and things like that. So, they had some, but the germ theory of disease is still a couple hundred years out. And, it wasn't like a germ warfare thing. There was just, they carried whatever diseases they carried. They came into contact with people, and people that did not have any exposure to those, suffered. And I don't know that it was necessarily they had poor hygiene. The things they didn't have were the skills to survive here when they arrived. A lot of the colonies that were early, they would be starving, and the native populations around them just didn't understand why they were starving, because there was plenty to eat all around them. They were ignorant about their surroundings because they weren't here long. So a lot of early colonies that failed, some of them dissipated because the life in the colony was miserable, and they went and lived amongst the peoples that were, already here. So I don't know. I don't think that I would say that it was necessarily a lack of hygiene.
I bring this about because and prepare ourselves to this conversation that we don't know where it's going to go to it. But I hear a lot of the people from the medicine community. You need to take care of the sewer system. You need to somehow get rid of the dispose of the human debris, or garbage or feces, everything, because that increased the possibility of having something far worse than what we got right now.
Human excretion does, the coronavirus does exist in human excretions of any kind. So that is a real concern in this particular situation we're facing right now. But there's another aspect, I think, to look at. See, the plagues introduced by Europeans because they're, the diseases we look at as childhood diseases now, they were bringing with them there, and they introduced them to a population that did not have them and had no immunity. They're disastrous for the population. But that extraction that they they were going to engage in, they needed labor, and they were destroying the labor. So one of their solutions was the importation of African workers. Millions of them brought in. So much so to the point when Mexico gains its independence in we say 1810. That's when the movement started. 1821 is when it's finally accomplished. It's the estimates are that 1 out of 6 people in what is now Mexico were Afro descendants. 1 out of 6. So there was a question of labor, and you have to rebuild the labor. It won't, it'll be until the time of Mexican independence that you get population that's starting to rebuild, even with the importation of African labor and intermingling with the native populations. Now, the thing is, we're looking at a situation where, listen to what some of these captains of industry and finance are saying. They're saying openly, well, so what if we lose, 3-4 million people? We have to keep the economy going. It's because they don't need the labor. They're saying it's the old people who are done with being productive that are expendable. And as far as the young ones, well, we're looking for robotics. We're looking at a situation here. Just take the situation in the United States. 54%, this is last year, of the fresh fruit that we consumed was imported. 30% of the fresh vegetables. So when they look at situations like this, one of their responses is, well, we don't need labor to grow agricultural products here. We'll import it. We'll let somebody else grow it. So we're in a very interesting situation, it seems to me. Yes, these tremendous population losses in the past, we can point to changes taking place. And where are we going to be? One, we don't know, but I am a little concerned that we're not going to be a situation that populations that have been decimated in the past have been in.
Okay, let me go back to a point that you made before, so we can stay on the subject as much as we can. The childhood diseases, they were brought in as a new disease for people who had no defense to it. And the way the situation we got right now is that we disseminate many of the animals. Some of these virus, a coronavirus, they were present on camels, on snakes, on bats, and different animals that we've been disseminating, and these things find a way into our system, into our species, and we are not prepared to confront it. Now, it's more to come as we disseminate what's around us, and we will have no way to defend ourselves because what we are creating.
But is it us creating it? That's how viruses work. They start in one species, they jump to another occasionally, they mutate and become viruses. Have been with us for a long time, and it's not necessarily anything we can do or not do to stop the evolution of new viruses. We can learn to respond. It would be nice if we, had better science education, more investment in science, more investment in healthcare. Well, I guess we're investing a lot in healthcare. We're just investing it in the insurance industry part of it. Because we do spend more than all the other countries on healthcare. It's just that nobody can afford to go to the doctor. And so viruses evolve, and we're going to be exposed to them like we are every year with a new, flu virus. Sometimes they're like this one. They have a very serious threat. Yeah, we need to develop a society that's capable of responding rationally to the threat of disease. Just off the conversations we were having earlier about the book Guns, Germs, and Steel, about how it affects a society if it doesn't respond rationally to disease. So you have these great empires like Egypt that was severely weakened by streptocomiasis. So they had it so bad they just assumed that people peed blood, that was just the normal state of affairs. They wound up having shorter lifespans and a much weaker workforce and everything else, and it contributed to the slow weakening of, the mighty empire of Egypt. And these other societies, when they were able to identify the life cycle of streptosomiasis, they were able to rationally respond. And so, like in China, the disease has a very peculiar life cycle where it's caused by a hookworm, and the hookworm lives part of its life in a snail, and then once it grows to a certain size, it leaves the snail and it crawls in through people's skin as they walk around near the water. So people that fish or work near the rivers get it. And then when they defecate, the eggs go back in and it infects another snail, and it's just that cycle. So they identified that cycle, and the problem was really bad in China and along the Yangtze. And they would go out during certain times of year and they would just crush all the snails they found and greatly reduce the population of the snails, and that abated streptosomiasis. And I think that if we can come up with some sort of rational, the solutions are there. We need to isolate ourselves. We need to quarantine ourselves. We need to identify the people that have the virus, and we need to make sure they're quarantined and they have access to whatever treatment we have. But the main thing is to quarantine the virus, and we see the effects. They're somewhat successful in slowing it in China and in South Korea, and we need to do what they're doing. It's working. And whether or not we have the capacity to respond rationally, or if we're going to be forced by our worship of Wall Street to just go ahead and suck it up, and then we're going to have millions of deaths versus hundreds of thousands of deaths. And I think that it's an avoidable tragedy. If we do those things, if we do isolate, if we do take the humane route, then we're going to have an economic problem where all of the people in the country that are at or near poverty aren't going to be able to make their rent in May. So they need the moratoriums on rent, right? And so they're passing, some cities are passing moratoriums on rent. But what happens in July when, they decide the emergency's over? Everybody's got to pay their rent, and nobody has the money saved up to pay all their back rent because they weren't working in, April and May and in June. Are we going to have just millions of people being homeless? How are we going to respond to that? All of these questions are in front of us, and
yes, let me bring about on the disease type thing, because I checked several people with whatever I could, and it's one that is Alexander Michacelli. I think he's from Russia, and has been in several epidemics in Vietnam, different things he's been observing this. And one of the things he said precisely what you say, many of these things are unavoidable. This virus is here, another one is trying to find his way into our species. It's unavoidable, but try to create the conditions and have the structure to properly fight against them. It's important to understand these things, not only the epidemic issue, but also the social preventions to the next wave of epidemics that are coming to us, which is what you were trying, I believe, to talk about it. Through this experience, what can we learn and how can we prevent, or what needs to be changed or people be aware in order to be more prepared with a better structure? Because the political structure that is today, at least in several parts of the world, is not really up to the challenge, seems like. Don't want to understand or don't understand. You just obey mainly the prophet, like you were saying, rather than the sense of the acknowledge of the people who knows these situations better than them. Or what do you think?
I don't know how we would repair it. We have, our society doesn't have the capacity right now to empower people that would make the proper choices. We choose our leaders based on who spends the most on campaigns and who can buy the most television and public relations and PR campaign, spending. And those are people that aren't going to make decisions based on reason. They're going to make decisions based on the people who fund their campaigns. So we have buffoons like Trump, who fortunately very few people believe him, and very few people are going to believe him even more after, a few more weeks of this. It's a tragedy. It's an avoidable tragedy. I think, what people are going to recognize, at least in the United States, is that we need a national healthcare service. We need a rational, way for sick people to go to the doctor. I think that people we're going to recognize that maybe, bailing out the stock market to the tune of $6 trillion isn't as important as bailing out people who are, going to be forced into homelessness. And we're going to have a massive housing crisis after this, worse than 2008. There's going to be more homeless people than the last financial crash. I don't know what to say other than had we paid more attention to rational solutions that function everywhere else, cut and paste those here. You look at Scandinavian healthcare, they live 10 years longer and they pay half as much as we do. Why aren't we doing it? We serve children miserable lunches that are more expensive than the gourmet food they prepare every day for the students in French schools. We're paying a lot more and we're getting a lot less. Right now, the solutions are in front of us, right? For this virus, people that are being successful at dealing with it are South Korea and China. Why aren't we doing what they're doing? Why aren't we taking the measures? Whether the stock market goes up and down, most people in this country don't have stock. So it's shouldn't be that important to them. They shouldn't care about what the Dow does. And they should vote for people who don't care about what the Dow does. They should vote for people that care about how they're doing. How do we arrange that? How do we get people to make rational decisions? Antonio, we've been having that conversation for a long time, and I just don't know how that's done.
Seems to me like the totalitarian countries are the ones that were more able and capable to take control of this issue than the so-called free world. What I saw in Telesur is that Russia, what it did is advise the population, let them know that they are limited, and they send anybody who sends signs of the disease, they send the doctor to his house and order him not to go out, in order for them not to run without capacity of taking care of if things get massive. So they took this approach of sending the doctors to where the people is and try to confine the people to the houses. All the totalitarian societies are the ones that they found a way to educate the population right quick and implement the solution, or at least minimize the damage.
We are not any less totalitarian than China. I'm sorry.
We don't think so.
We have more people in jail than China. We have, more people in our secret police than the East Germans ever did. We have, massive surveillance on private citizens that, I'm sorry, we don't live in a free world. That's not the situation here either. And so
it's what they keep telling us, and we buy it. Many people buy it.
Oh, I'm sorry.
We don't realize, though we claim to live in a democracy with these so-called electeds, that the real power, the real totalitarian power, are the damn bankers like Jamie Dimon and these other people from Goldman Sachs and Chase and the big 7 or 8 banks that basically have their way with the U.S. government anytime they want to.
Well, we got other people here on the call. Ayala, you got a different situation. You are on Chicago. Chicago is in a quarantine stage, severe limitations of movement, maybe not so severe, but very limited. And you got also the problem of not being out of work. What's your situation, Ayala?
After the government and the city of Chicago and the state government and the city of Chicago, they call it for the quarantine. A lot of us we work in construction. We were forced to leave our jobs because it was prohibited for working, especially work like that I do. I'm a carpenter, but we do a residential, not so much commercial. Commercial construction is still working a little bit, but residential construction is totally paralyzed. I mean, zero. It's nothing, you know. Maybe it's one or two working around us. We are out of work, and of course, the companies don't pay us if we don't work. So if we have something saving in our savings accounts, whoever have the chance to have a savings account or a checking account, well, they've been using now for surviving, you know. We are surviving out of the money that we've been saving. As you know, everything, you know, is going into the toilet, man. I mean, rent, bills, everything, you know, and there is no solution. There is no solution. There is no help. The city of Chicago yesterday announced that they're going to have some kind of lottery, even for people with no papers. So, I mean, I hate to say illegal because that's not the right word. So undocumented people, they can participate too, but it's a lottery. So that means even if you put your name, in the end, they're gonna choose who get it and who don't. So that doesn't mean it's a real help, right? But whoever receives the help, I mean, it's good. But we're talking about, we are around Chicago and vicinities, I mean, the suburbs, almost 10 million people. So keep that in mind. How many people is really out of work? You know, how many people is working? It's a big number. It's a big number, and the other compass been saying, you know, it's gonna show up when the people can have money to pay the rent. When the people can have money to pay the mortgage, when the people has no money to pay even the cell phones or any service, then the struggle is going to start happening because the companies that are owners of buildings or they're going to start feeling the real pain, more us than we are aware. So we live in some way, I don't want to say we live by the day, but if we use all the money that we have, and then we will be like George says, you know, teacher George, Professor George, I'm sorry, says we're going to be on the streets with another millions of people too. And this is not a weird exaggeration or a weird, this is a nightmare, and it's a real nightmare. And the way I see it is the government, is not doing enough. It's not doing enough to stop it, and they can, you know, they can. They are the owners. Again, with the other people, select people who have all the companies and banks. So yeah, it's not gonna be easy getting out of this, and it's gonna be repercussion, bad repercussion, especially for people like me and many others.
Yes, this is pretty much the picture that you say that is going to increment many falls over, isn't it?
Yeah, it's going to mushroom. And again, this is in 2 weeks. If the curve continues, yeah, we're looking at many thousands of people dying. You know, we're looking at the 1st of April's coming. This is going to be a month after many people haven't been to work. There are cities are passing moratoriums on evictions. The state of California has passed a moratorium on evictions for foreclosed loans, and people are going to have to pay those things, right? We haven't let anybody off the hook or forgiven debt or any of those things. And so when we do have to pay it back, let's say they decide the crisis is over in July or August, then you've got like 4 months of rent to come up with after not working for 4 months. And
so they got ways to mitigate this now, but it's going to.
Right, they're not. The moratorium is on. You can't get evicted. You're still, racking up the bill. They can't turn off your electricity, but you're still racking up the bill, and you're not working. Where are those resources going to come from? And then when people can't pay them, where are they going to go? Because obviously the homeless shelter space isn't there. We've not developed any social safety net. Our social safety net over the years has just been gutted. And we don't have any of these systems in place. And these systems take time to build. These systems take staff, and they take policies, and they take a lot of resources, and certainly $1,200 isn't going to fix it. Extending unemployment for a few months isn't going to fix it. A lot of people are going to be, shut out of unemployment because the sorts of labor, right? If a lot of people that work in the gig market, like Uber and everything else, don't collect it, and a lot of people are in those types of circumstances where they're private contractors or, 100 other ways they hire people without having to pay benefits nowadays. And so, they can extend unemployment, but that doesn't affect a large part of the working population. So all of these social safety net programs that aren't there are going to become vital. They would have been so useful right now, and they're not there. So we don't have a rational response to this. And now there's going to be millions of people asking, why am I homeless? Why is my family member homeless? Because of a disease, because of an illness. Why are we as a society so unprepared? We're told we're the richest and greatest civilization in the history of human whatever, and we're getting leveled by a cold. It's mind-boggling that people have no idea what's coming. You can see some people, screaming on the floor of Congress, like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, God love her, but, they passed a $6 trillion bailout bill. If it happens like it did in 2008, all that cash is going to be stored in a bank in the Cayman Islands somewhere. Nobody's going to be spending that into the economy. And the people they're bailing out with the $1,200 check, that's going to cover maybe a third of their deductible on their insurance if they're lucky enough to have insurance. And
nothing of food.
Right. Or toilet paper. I think that's like a roll of toilet paper right now, isn't it? I mean,
it's something that I don't understand why people don't want to have a conscience clean instead of the rear end. Maestro Garcia, you are at the risk age, so do I. What's your view on this?
Well, my view on this is that the response of our leaders is absolutely ridiculous. I mean, $1,200 to go through this? How are we going to protect ourselves? How are we going to survive? I mean, Canada at least had, they go through the charade. They're saying $2,000 a month for 4 months for people. That's more significant action, but it's still not going to cover it. And when they openly say, to save corporations, to save the banks, we can just print money. Why can't they print money to save people? Well, if there's a silver lining, there's a lot of us older people that are so-called unproductive that maybe will be removed from the population and make way for houses and jobs for younger people then.
Well, all of these kind of give us a very dark picture for the most immediate future, within a few weeks.
Yeah.
This going to throw the population into some sort of fear, nightmare, and also maybe upsetting against why the system is not functioning. What do you think it could change? If people get so scared by this that they are forced to look upon the structure that is being built and how functional it is on the favor of the weak, against the weak, not
Well, the problem is an awful lot of people in this country don't see themselves as weak. They haven't gotten to that point. One of the themes that run through all the programs we've done is that the solution doesn't come from a savior, from somebody out there who's going to save us, but we have to start taking responsibility for this situation, at least our part of it, and do something, demand, start taking action.
Yes. What do you think? Maybe people positive forces due to the dark picture that we kind of gonna see in short time.
Well, I think a lot more people are, they're seeing the failures of the structure, and I think, hopefully, because we're trained very well to blame ourselves, right, for poverty, blame ourselves for not being a billionaire. And that doesn't work. with a virus, and that it's going to kill rich people, it's going to kill poor people. I would hope that opens up a lot of people's eyes that these circumstances are they're going to come around, and we do have capacity as we're not hopeless and helpless. We have, people out there saying, what needs to be done. And we have, rational, reasonable responses that we could have available to us if we structured our society in a more humane way. I don't know what people overall are going to react. If you look at the past, we'll probably, burn a few witches and carry on as normal.
Okay, Ayala, what do you think?
You guys did a really good topic about doing history about disease, why Europeans came to America, and how they developed all this disease, and how, in one way or another, one survive. When this kind of disease like this one is developed in a way affects really not only Afros or Latinos, but also white people, especially old ones. You have to think about it like these people who develop this disease in a laboratory and let it go. What was the purpose? I know what you're saying, Antonio. Like you say, like, yes, it's an environment. I understand all that, but this virus, especially, is loose in a certain point and a certain ways, and you have to think about that. I mean, it's a disaster economically for any country. So how we're gonna the repercussions that everybody's paying around the world, and especially China and Europe, how we're gonna confront that in the future? You see, like in Mexico, which is not so far from the United States, things are totally different. How is the Mexican people, not only the Mexican people, but people like in poverty, like in Mexico, because people is not, even though Mexico looks like a rich country, it's not a rich country in many ways, and because it has a lot of poverty. How the people is not getting so infected, like in United States, and maybe it's phases of the virus attacking, but a lot of people is immune to this. If it's not an attack and this thing just get loose, well, we're paying the repercussions really bad. But it wasn't a purpose. We are losing anyway, Just like Jeff said, like we're gonna put the bodies and whoever have the power, they're gonna get over,
Well, this is part of the thing. If we somehow don't see what to do and how to change things in favor of the weak, they already organize themselves to see this in favor of themselves. Like Jeff pointed to it, many of the bailouts are far superior to the ones they give it to millions of people to save themselves. If out of this situation, can we better at least our chances, or are we going to allow them to, play with us? I don't know. What to think about that, Jeff?
Yeah, I don't know. I hope that we wise up. There's, been times in history where people have, I have a lot less money than the CEO of Goldman Sachs, and so I should probably get the money before he does. Apparently, it didn't happen that way, and so it didn't happen that way for most of us. That's obvious. They've done that right in front of our face. As more and more people catch on to that they were expendable, they had to go to work and risk getting the virus and spreading the virus, and we lost an extra million or two people because we didn't do what rational countries did. If it goes that way, people are going to get more and more angry, and they're going to be angry at the people that did this. Because they did it right out in the open. I don't know how long that's going to take, but I wouldn't think it's going to take that long. It took like a year and a half, 2 years after 2008, right? In late 2008, then you had Occupy in 2011. I think that we're in for another larger social movement of that nature. I can't see how it wouldn't happen. The response to this has just been criminal and grotesque. To speak to the point made earlier about how, in Mexico it's spreading this way and not that way. Well, Mexico just doesn't have the sort of critical mass of travel that the United States does. And so the disease was going to appear here first. And wherever the disease appears, then it starts to spread and expand. And so, Mexico's probably a week or two behind us, just like we were a week or two behind Italy. And China was at the forefront of it because that's where it was first encountered. The epidemiology of it, the way it's going to spread, the number of people that it's going to infect is going to continue. It just has to do with proximity to whoever, how close you are to somebody who's sick. The thing doesn't have to have been made in a lab. These kinds of things evolve. It's not a mystery. Scientists understand it and have been warning about it for a long time and have been encouraging governments to institute policies to respond to these kinds of things for a long time. And, perhaps it's time we start to pay more attention to what scientists say, because this is what happens when we don't. I'm not saying science is always right or always fun.
Well, time is kind of short. We can edit always, at least use my personal phone call that I receive or something. But Maestro Garcia, in short, ¿qué piensa?
I hope I survive long enough to see the reaction to this one, because the 2008, it brought us Occupy, it brought us various types of resistance, and then they move ahead with TARP and all that, and it just goes back to this is worse than the reaction of that time. So I'm hoping for a stronger resistance that actually brings about some kind of structural change.
Well, maybe this is better than all the social theories that we've been developing in order to change things. People are scared by nature. People are scared about something that we contribute to it, by not understanding it or increasing the possibility of these things to develop. Well, to all of you, gracias, thank you. And I think we are just right on the edge of time. Hopefully, Michael doesn't have that much troubles to trim this thing out. And then, once again, this was the history of the wars. And on the history of the wars, we try to and make attempts to see if we can understand why we think the way we think, with the hope that understanding that we may change or are able to change the conditions that brought us to this situation. Thank you. Esta fue la historia de las palabras. Muchas gracias.